My name is Santiago GUILLÉN ROZO. I am a lecturer with a fixed-term contract at the Université Lumière Lyon 2 in France, and I am a member of the research lab ICAR UMR5191 from the École Normale Supérieure de Lyon, the Centre National de la Recherche Scientifique, and the Université Lumière Lyon 2. So I teach mainly in the Department of Linguistics of the UFR LESLA, Literature, Linguistics and Arts. And my main domains of research and teaching are general linguistics, history of linguistic theories, semiotics, semantics, discourse analysis, pragmatics, and philosophy of language. So I am pleased to welcome you to this podcast entitled Logoï, which is devoted to sciences and more particularly the sciences of culture. That would be the Kulturwissenschaften in the German tradition. That would be the humanities and social sciences in English. This podcast is intended for specialists in various fields, but also for specialists in other fields, as well as for anyone who has an interest in research in the humanities and social sciences. In this podcast, I will be presenting my own research work, as well as the work of fellow researchers in different areas in sciences of culture, of humanities and social sciences. So what does Logoï means? Logoï is the word that the philosophers from ancient Greece gave to the rational discourses. This distinction comes mainly from Plato, who is considered to be the founder of the philosophy in ancient Greece and the Occidental tradition. Even if obviously there were philosophers before Plato, so for example the ones that we call the pre-Socratic ones, for example Pythagoras, Thales, Heraclitus, etc., whose work is very well studied by Nietzsche, who was a great philosopher but also a great philologist. Nietzsche criticized obviously Socrates, because for him one of the most brilliant expressions in ancient Greece was the work of the myth in tragedies. Especially the one by Aeschyle and Sophocles, and less the one from Euripides. He criticized Euripides very much. Well, he didn't like him as much as he liked Aeschyle and Sophocles. So Plato makes this distinction between Logoi and Mutoi. Logoi is then the rational discourses, and Mutoi would be the discourses of fiction. Sometimes in English it is translated by fable. And this gives the word that we use today as myth. It comes from the definition that Plato gives to mutos, and mutoi is the plural, mutos is the singular. So why does Plato found the mutoi and makes this distinction between logoia and mutoi? So Plato gets inspired by the mathematical discourse from Pythagoras that inspires him to found philosophy. What is the particularity of the mathematical discourse from Pythagoras that interests Plato? It is the fact that mathematical discourse from Pythagoras has a demonstrative telos. That means that its objective is to demonstrate something, and particularly to demonstrate a truth. And so Plato gets inspired by this, and in his philosophical discourse he tries to demonstrate a truth that is based on reality for Plato. And so mathematical discourse and philosophical discourse have this in common, the fact that the particularity that they try to demonstrate something and to demonstrate a truth. And that is opposed to the work of Logoï, Mutoi, because Mutoi are the discourses of fiction, and so for Plato, the Logoi, the discourse of reason, have the particularity that they can access truth. They can give an access to truth, but this is not the case for Mutoi, the fictional discourses that have not a direct access to truth. That is why that is one of the senses of myth in English language and other languages today. For example, in French you have the word mythomane. A mythomane is the one that always says things that are not true, that are false. So Mutoi are the discourses that cannot access truth, and Logoi are the discourses that can access truth for Plato. Even if Plato uses myth in his philosophical work, but when Plato uses myth in his philosophical work, he uses it in order to demonstrate something, so in a general logic of demonstration. This difference between Logoï and Mutoi, I studied it in detail in my book Semiotics du mythe, published by Classique Garnier in January 2026, and the collection is Semiotics, directed by Astrid Guillaume, senior lecturer at Sorbonne Université. So the title Semiotics du mythe would translate to Semiotics of myth. And so, what is the difference between Kulturwissenschaften and Naturwissenschaften? The Naturwissenschaften in the German tradition are the sciences of nature, Geisteswissenschaften are the sciences of the mind, and Geistes translate to esprit in French and would translate to mind in English, and Kulturwissenschaften are the sciences of culture. So what are the differences between these three different branches of sciences in the German tradition? So they have differences, they have epistemological differences. So epistemological comes from the Greek word episteme. Episteme refers to or has the meaning of knowledge. And so epistemology is the fact that in a certain domain, in a certain sciences, you have a reflection about how to create knowledge and particularly how to access the truth. Truth is systematic inside a domain, inside the sciences, and so each science has to have a reflection about how to have an access to truth in that specific domain. So what are the epistemological differences between Naturwissenschaften and Kulturwissenschaften? So in the Kulturwissenschaften you have several main authors. You have, for example, Max Weber, who is a sociologist, and Ernst Cassirer, who is a philosopher who works on epistemology and epistemology, and we could say that he's also a semiotician because he develops the work of Ferdinand de Saussure. Ferdinand de Saussure is the founder of modern linguistics and semiology in Europe. The other founder of semiotics is Charles Sanders Peirce in the United States, at the same time, more or less, that Saussure. So, what are the differences between Naturwissenschaften and Kulturwissenschaften? So, for Cassirer, for example, he says that Naturwissenschaften, sciences of nature, are constitutive, and Kulturwissenschaften are institutive. What does this mean? It means that in Naturwissenschaften the object pre-exists to the observer, but in the other hand, in Kulturwissenschaften the object is created, is instituted. So, for example, in Naturwissenschaften you study objects such as plants, such as animals, such as the stars in the skies, for example. So the object pre-exists, but in Kulturwissenschaften the object is created through science and systems of meaning and value, such as natural languages. For Ferdinand de Saussure, natural languages are the most important systems of meaning and values of cultures. So objects are created through science for Ferdinand de Saussure. For Peirce, the sign has a relation with the object. Sign is something that refers to something else. So for Charles Sanders Peirce, a sign is something which stands to somebody for something at some regard or capacity. Peirce gets inspired actually by the scholastic philosophers and the expression aliquid pro aliquo, and they get inspired also by Augustin, the work of Augustin. Because I explained that in detail in my book. But signs, for Ferdinand de Saussure, the object is created with the sign in the cultural languages. So it is instituted, the object does not exist. So for example, sign for Ferdinand de Saussure, you had the signified and the signifier. The signified, signifiant, signifier, signifié. The signified refers to the plan d'expression, that is the perception of the sign, and signifié refers to the conceptual part of the sign. So in languages, you create concepts through signs. So this explains why you have certain concepts in certain languages, in certain cultures, but you don't have those concepts in other languages and in other cultures. So concepts are cultural, things created through signs inside of systems of meaning and value inside of cultures. And so this is important because the nature of the object that we're studying is different from the nature of the object of the Naturwissenschaften, the sciences of nature. The nature of the sign for Ferdinand de Saussure is psychological. It exists only in the mind of people and through social conventions, thanks to social conventions. This is why we linguists advocate for the conservation of different languages in the world. Why? Because when the speakers of a language die, also dies the language. And with the language, the death of the language also dies all the meanings and value from this meanings and values from this particular group of people, this community. And the language is defined as a vision of the world from Wilhelm von Humboldt. So when a language dies, also dies a certain vision of the world. And so that is the difference between Naturwissenschaften and Kulturwissenschaften. Naturwissenschaften constitutive, Kulturwissenschaften institutive. And so that is the reason why we can't study objects of Kulturwissenschaften with the epistemology, the theories and the methodology from the Naturwissenschaften. Why is that? Because, for example, you can study verbal language through the theories and methodologies from neuroscience, neurobiology. It is very important to have this knowledge in order to know how biologically and how our brains works and allows us to communicate and use verbal language and other cultural languages. So that is a very important knowledge, but it is not enough to understand the complexity of language, because the nature of the object of language is a particular one. It has a cultural nature, and not a nature based on nature itself, Naturwissenschaften. It is a nature based on culture. And so that is what we'll be studying in this podcast through different researchers, my research, but also the research of fellow researchers in different domains in the sciences of culture, in the humanities and social sciences. Thanks so much for your attention.